Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is Aneesh de Vos, and we have, drum rolling there, apart from our amazing guests, we have the man that is, the enigma, the fantastic, the wonderful, the wonderful, the gorgeous, the glamorous, can't think of anything more, but there might come a little bit later, Mr. David Buckler. David, how are you doing?
After that introduction, how can I be anything else but wonderful, marvellous, brilliant, energetic for this time of the day on a Saturday afternoon? So thank you again, eye roll time, but much appreciated.
Very welcome. But enough of you, David, enough of you. Our guest this week is amazing. And I am, as ever, terribly, terribly excited to introduce you to Dr. Cynthia Phelps. Dr. Cynthia Phelps practices badass self-compassion like you have never seen before. And I, as you know, love the word compassion, love the action of compassion, love doing self-compassion. Cynthia does it in a way that just makes my spine tingle. Cynthia, you have a business called Inner Ally. Tell us about it.
Sure. Well, the business name gives away quite a bit. Inner friend, inner ally. And so the purpose of my business is to really help people be able to pay attention to their inner voice and craft inner language for themselves that's self-compassionate. Largely because we know that people that practice self-compassion have wonderful outcomes, emotional, mental outcomes. They have less depression, stress, anxiety, and some of my research shows a correlation between risk for addiction. And so if you have higher levels of self-compassion, you actually have lower level or lower risk for addiction. And so I'm always excited to teach people kind of how to hone their inner voice to thrive in life.
Fantastic. You couldn't have put it better. David, before Cynthia came on, and can I just add, you are the first doctor we have had on our chat. So Community Connections are very, very happy to have you, Dr. Cynthia Phelps. And I said before, is it okay if I say doctor? Because, you know, as women, there is a thing that women don't always use that title. So Dr. Cynthia Phelps is with us. For every woman that has got their doctorate and is not using it, use that title. David, that's the only man on the screen.
Couldn't agree more.
Couldn't agree more. David, you were chatting before with us, and you commented on this idea of a second arrow. Do you want to bring that through?
Yeah. It was something that intrigued me about one of Cynthia's blogs, or part of a series of blogs, which is entitled "Don't Shoot the Second Arrow." And I said that I have heard a description of, or a presentation of, similar ideas, but never seen it put so succinctly. And I wanted to ask Cynthia if she would like to take us through what that actually means.
I think that would be a great way to start. So I am actually a certified teacher of mindful self-compassion in addition to being a doctor. And I say that because that was the first time I ran into that parable of the second arrow. And so I've heard it as a Native American story. I've heard it as a Buddhist story, but the gist of it is that a warrior goes off to war and gets injured, gets shot with an arrow. And they come back and he says, "Oh, I can't believe that I just got shot with an arrow. You know, now I'm not gonna be able to be in the battle. I'm such a terrible warrior." And the leader who he was talking to basically said, "Well, don't shoot a second arrow." where the first arrow was the one in battle that he got shot with. And so this is the stuff we run into in life all the time that we can't change. A pandemic, you know, people, we lose people out of our lives. We have grief and loss. These physical pain, all of these are first arrow problems. The second arrow is what happened when he went back and said, like, oh, I can't believe I failed, you know, I'm a terrible warrior. What's happening there is you're actually using your inner language to shoot yourself with a second arrow. So your inner language is harming you. And so like, here's the first layer of suffering that you got when in battle. And then you layer on another layer if you speak to yourself in a way that is harsh or critical. And so, you know, oftentimes I frame it as the inner critic because people can kind of grab onto that term. Most of us have heard, you know, most of us understand what that means. You know, the inner critic tends to show up if you're doing creative projects and taking a risk, or if you've, you know, said something ridiculous or you screw something, you know, fail at something, right? It's always there to be like, oh, I can't believe you did that. Maybe even name calling, right? And so I think that story of the second arrow really kind of clarifies for us that this second layer, that is a choice, right? We can choose, you know, to not do it. Or, you know, in practice, kind of what happens is we have the painful experience, whatever it's like, and then this happens automatically. But if we can use some mindfulness and practice of self-compassion, we can lift it off and free ourselves from the pain of that. Because I'm sure you've probably either had the experience of yourself or met someone who is stuck in that second pain. Like, they made the bad decision a long time ago, you know, but this is still hanging around and plaguing them. And so, you know, that's one of the things that having a compassionate, a self-compassionate inner voice can really help with.
That's a lovely process, isn't it? And I like that thing of, you know, this happened a long time ago, yet this is the thing that's keeping you there, this second arrow. I mean, it really is holding you down. Cynthia, I love the fact, I love that even the wording of your business, you know, the inner ally, that just says everything. How do you get to create a business like that? Because I'm hearing that you're not only trained in this, that you actually understand what you're talking about because you've got some experience in there of a lived experience. How do you create this as your work, as your business?
Well, that is quite a journey of an answer.
I like to do big ones.
Right. I can start by saying, you know, I was trained as a researcher. My PhD is actually in pharmacology with a focus in neuroscience. And I very quickly became interested in learning and behavior change and then went on to actually think about how to create technology-based tools to help us change our behavior and things like that as a professor for a while. And so that's kind of my default way of solving problems. But in terms of like, how did I come up with the process, which I'll probably explain later, but it was really from my own personal trauma experience. I had some childhood neglect, which went completely unrecognized until very late in life. And I think it put me at risk for substance use disorder. I actually started abusing alcohol after I went through a very challenging divorce that just had a lot of loss and grief with it. And I found myself stuck in this cycle of addiction. And so I was actually at a health science center, working at a health science center. I checked myself into outpatient rehab. And I learned all about how to work my life so that I didn't have to drink. But the problem was it didn't deal with my core issue, and that was shame. Oh. Nobody taught me anything about that. And so I was desperate to be normal and desperate to be accepted for who I was. And so you can imagine that I eventually, kept drinking. And I was in this really unhealthy space of trying to manage that and be a regular person, and it was bad. And I had this moment where I was reading an article about Dr. Kristen Neff's research. And so she's a premier researcher in self-compassion. And I had one of those aha moments, you know, where everything stands still and you remember right where you were. And it was like, oh, this is what I'm missing. Like I do not even have any of this. And so from that moment, I started reading research articles. I read her book about it. And then I started taking her classes, and eventually I trained as a teacher. And so it was only like maybe 3 or 4 months after that I set a sober date when I started on this learning journey. And it's been over 8 years now, and wow. I am just so excited to say that filling this hole in me was what I really needed to have a more resilient and like higher levels of well-being, and to just really give myself the opportunity to thrive in life. Yeah.
You know what? Thank you for sharing that. I can just see your real joy that you connected into that, and that made that difference. So I'm assuming that was the difference that lifted that second arrow for you. That was the difference that jumped in on there. David, do you want to come on in on that?
No, we have similar experience.
David's frozen slightly there, which is not done for ages.
And especially that the light bulb moment happened to me. I too had the light bulb moment and thought I found what I'm looking for after all this time, after searching. Mine was slightly different, but I so much relate to it, and I don't know, it was such an epiphany. It sort of knocked me sideways, and I guess you felt much the same, because not only that, I think sometimes it's under your nose all of the time. And I think that's why we miss it. I don't know what your opinion is on that, whether it was obvious to you when you got it, because hindsight's a perfect science, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll tell just another story, which I think will be telling about that. It is the end of teacher training, and I'm almost done with all of that work, and then all I have to do is put in hours to get my certification, right, in teaching self-compassion. And I'm in teacher training, and Dr. Neff was actually teaching that one. And so she began to tell a story that actually I'd already read in her book. And she, her autistic son at the time was like 9 or 10, pretty young. And he had a complete meltdown in the grocery store. And, as a mom, there's not much you can do, because the child is rolling and kicking and screaming and red-faced, and everybody's looking at you like, why are you beating your child, and so she really modeled for us as students in her class what her inner voice was. And she put her hand on her heart, and she just said to herself, oh, darling, this is so hard. I'm so sorry you have to go through this. And I was like, what? You can do that? Like, you can be that kind to yourself? Like, that's when it was like the second light bulb, right? Because I realized I had studied self-compassion. I read all the research, and here was this huge component that I was completely missing. And I thought to myself, like, I kind of am a smarty pants, and if I couldn't have figured this out for myself, I bet there's a lot of other people that haven't sorted this out for themselves either. And so when she spoke in that voice, what immediately came to mind for me is the grandmother. I don't know if you can see that. Let's see. There we go. And so that's when the grandmother avatar was birthed, if you will, because that kind and nurturing voice just sounded to me like everybody's best grandmother, you know, just keeping you up and nurturing you in the time. And so that was the birth of the beginning of the Inner Allies, which are a whole cast of characters that you can use to guide your inner language. And so I did a little bit more research and was looking at like, what is it that people really need to nurture? You know, what are their core emotional needs? Sometimes I call them essential emotions. And when I'm talking about the inner allies, I call them superpowers.
I love your language.
I know, right? Well, I like to make it relatable, you know, because it's like sometimes the self-help stuff is very droll, right? We need to make it a little more fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I found a body of research actually called Schema therapy. Yeah. And it is, you know, the short of it is that a psychologist basically noticed there were trends in patients that showed up that were not making progress. And so he was doing CBT for cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very common talk. Yeah. And so he noticed that he could put his patients in these different buckets of kind of largely what went wrong in early childhood and what they didn't get, and then how they were acting out as a result. These, you know, he calls it maladaptive behaviors, but it's basically like things we do to shoot ourselves in the foot, right? Like
the second arrow stuff,
the second arrow stuff, right? Well, it turns out if you look at the opposite of that second arrow stuff, what you get are these core emotional needs. And so that's what each of the inner allies has with it, a core emotional need. And so, you know, the grandmother is nurturing and optimism. We've got the monk is serenity. Another one that I really love is the innocent, and it's self-acceptance. And so we know that these are universal kind of human needs, and everybody on the planet shares all of them. But just like with schema therapy, people tend to have a profile based on, you know, their childhood. And so it turns out your inner voice is largely unconsciously adopted from your early childhood caretakers. And so if you had a caretaker who was harsh or cruel with themselves, you know, talk down to themselves or towards you, this is the type of inner voice you're going to adopt. And so, you know, I actually have a quiz that I call like, who's your inner ally, which sounds very approachable, but it's literally like an adoption of the schema therapy, like maladaptive questions to try to find out like, okay, like what's not working for you in your life? Because, you know, we all know that we don't have to have a diagnosis to be maybe not living in the most high quality mental and emotional life. I think the pandemic has really kind of drove that home, right? Like there's subtleties, right? Yeah. And so that's why I really love working in the framework of a wellness space rather than, you know, waiting for somebody to show up who's ill and having a problem. Like these are things we can actually practice, speaking, noticing your inner language, and then developing and practicing self-compassionate language along with kind of your core emotional needs can be a buffer, right? It's a little bit more like preventative medicine than it is like a treatment.
And it moves away from that concept. David and I bang on it about it a lot, this concept of curing people but it's about that recognition that things aren't always the way that you have wanted them to be, but how can we get you to a place where that you can work with what's happened to you, but with this self-compassion. And Cynthia, do you know what I love about your work is I love that it's fun. I love that you've got a little grandma one, a little monk one. I love this, that it really does personify, because I know when I'm working with people using, you know, compassionate approaches, etc., sometimes people, they're just like, well, I don't know how to create a compassionate other. And I actually really like those ideas of, well, you know, here's a card. Look, this is what I think what my grandma used to say. I had a lovely English, well, I had 3 lovely grandmas, but one of them, I'm just thinking of her at the moment when I used to go and stay, because my mum worked a lot. So we got ourselves dressed. We were what we call in the UK latchkey kids. So we got ourselves dressed. When I went to stay with Granny, Granny would put my knickers and socks on the fire to warm. And then she'd get me dressed in the morning and say, cock your leg up, Sparrow. Oh my God, when I think of that, you know, so that was like this huge holiday and she'd bring me breakfast. She would make me porridge. She would keep the top off the milk. She'd put brown sugar. I mean, literally, this is disgusting. I wouldn't eat it now. But she would cover it with brown sugar. She'd carpet it. And I felt so cared. And I can tell you that when I go back to my days where I wake up and I think, gee, this is not a good day for me. Do you know what I do? I go downstairs, I make myself porridge, I talk to myself in my granny's voice. Okay, I use like coconut sugar or I use honey and a dollop of yogurt, you know, so it's a bit different. But I do that, and I know on those days that I am literally bringing my granny back in, who used to take care of me in a way that my mum couldn't. She had 4 children to look after. She had to go to work.
And how nurturing that is for you. Like, turn that day around, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
it
that's
really
just
does.
Delightful. Thank you for sharing that wonderful story.
It was when I saw the granny one, I was like, I know a story about that. My granny did that for me. And it is really important. David, have you got a little, a little nourishing, yummy story? Mine is porridge. Always food.
I don't think it's particularly yummy, but I mean, my epiphany was actually when I started to study too. I'd been through the whole process of rehab and come out the other end. And like most people fresh out, I'm scared to death of making a mistake and slipping back to where I was before. And it's draining. But I started to look at modalities of, I was always heavily been into philosophy. And I think I had this identity crisis, and I didn't even know what an identity crisis was. I'd been a businessman and quite successful in a senior position in industry for years, 25, 30 years. And my identity was glued to my job. And when that was gone, there I am in no man's land, wondering who I was and working through, if you like, from the viewpoint of the existentialists, I found that I really didn't need an identity. I could just be who I was. And that was, it was almost like I'd been struck by a bolt of lightning. And I remember writing it in an assignment allied to the work I was doing. And I was staring at the page for a long time, just realizing what that meant. I could put all that stuff aside and not dash here than everywhere, and nothing was time limited and nothing was measured, and I could just sit still. And
I just want to sit in that space with you right now.
Yeah.
That sounds so amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think it comes to us in many ways, and I think that is why at that point I thought to myself, I'm going to pass this on. It's too big to keep, and I want other people to see what I see. And that just sounds a bit boastful, but I think
no.
It was just so huge that I thought, I just can't hang on to this. It's too big to be my possession. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet it felt like kind of taking something off of your, just like, oh, I give this back, like I don't have to keep it.
Mm. Then from then on, I found all about, because, there was trauma in my life too. And post-traumatic growth means a lot to me. And I think a lot of people in recovery end up at that point where this is huge, I'm giving this away. And that's why so many recovering alcoholics end up in a service industry, I think.
Yeah, I think that it really helps us. It helps me. I serve in a couple of ways. I run meetings through a nonprofit called She Recovers. And then I also lead meditations through the Center for Mindful Self Compassion. And both of those kinds of volunteer opportunities are service to other people. It feeds me. Yeah, I totally agree with you.
I love that sense that this in service, this giving back that you've both really pointed out, and the fact that it, it feeds you. Can I ask both of you, David, I brought you down into the guest thing now, but can I ask both of you of what is it that it feeds you? What does it feed about you? What is that?
That's a great question.
That's what I do.
I'm like, I've got an inner ally for that.
Yeah.
So this is the artist, and the artist's superpower is expression, which is basically the need to feel seen or the need to be heard. And because of my childhood, that is one of my core emotional needs that's good for me to nurture, to help me to thrive. And so if I can set my life up in ways where I'm in a place where I can be seen and heard, like right now is fantastic. Yeah. Therapy on the fly for me. Then it's really meeting a core emotional need of mine.
Okay, I seriously, I've got to get your card, Cynthia. David, I love that, because I can just see myself using them when I'm working, and I love little, because I never think that therapy is just about, I've said this lots of times, I never think that therapy is just about speaking. Sometimes I think it's about, believe it or not, silence. But I also like things that bring in that addition, that just change the dynamics and make it more movable, so that it's not just, I'm on a chair and you're on a chair. I like it to be movable, because I suppose because I am a somatic worker, that then means that people start investing all of themselves in it. But David, what feeds you? Putting you on the spot today, love.
Yeah.
You're freezing a lot today, David. He's not been freezing lately. You froze, David.
I have no idea what empathy was.
It's frozen again.
But I think going through the process of getting well, if you like, for want of a better description, put me in that place. Put me, having been to a place where tomorrow doesn't matter, and then tomorrow suddenly becomes the most important thing in the world, I think makes a big difference. It's such a total 180 from having no life to a life that means something. And I think, coming back to what I said, I wanted to share that so much. I wanted to stand on a tall building and scream and shout it from the top of my voice. But the best way to do it when the dust had settled was to learn to be a psychotherapist. Yeah.
I feel as though I'm sat with two incredibly accomplished people, and not just because of the qualifications that you hold, though I totally and utterly respect and appreciate all the work that you've done, but the fact that you are allowing yourself in this space to be vulnerable, to say, do you know what, this happened to me, and this is who I am now, and this is the change. I think that is such a message for people to have.
Yeah, and I think, coming back to the whole cycle of addiction, a lot of people in addiction need to see someone who's been through that, and need to see what you can do. You know, so the very fact of going back to university at the ripe old age of 47, that I impressed an awful lot of people unknown to me, and I get quite a bit of feedback from time to time. Thanks for being such an inspiration. And it wasn't shouting from the rooftops; it was doing stuff, not talking about stuff. Yeah.
Cynthia, what about you? You've been very open about the past when you've experienced addiction as a means of coping, but now it's changed for you, and you're here sharing that. And this idea that of serving people, and for sure you are. What is the feedback?
Well, first, I just want to acknowledge, that it took years for me to get to a point where I am right now, where I'm just like, blah, 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 and telling my stories and childhood drama. and I do think that is super critical. And the feedback I get is, I would say, the vast majority of it is very positive. As I kind of put myself out there more and more on different platforms and talk about my work and what I'm doing, there are a significant number of people who want to push back on it, who are not happy with me and what I'm doing. And I think maybe that's just I don't think that has anything to do with me, honestly. I think that once you get to a certain level of people who are paying attention to you, that you're going to have the haters.
Yeah.
But usually when I speak in context of my addiction story, people really have a lot of grace. And I think that's becoming more socially acceptable to, it's not really socially acceptable anymore in the US to make fun of addicts. That's kind of not cool anymore. So even though it's kind of in some of our culture still, people don't overtly do it. And so that's nice.
So that shows that outward compassion, because it's true, isn't it? People would be, they're just a drug addict, they've always got their head stuck in a bottle, etc. I mean, these derogatory things that people say, and invariably, I've been training with Paul Gilbert recently, compassion focused therapy. Yeah, I love this guy. One of the things that so you don't wake up and say, do you know what, this morning I'm going to be this terrible whatever, or I know in my life this is what I'm going to do. You don't. Circumstances take you there, because invariably something has really hurt you. Something has hurt you to such an extent that you don't want to live in that life, in that reality, because it just hurts too much. So I'm all for this movement coming across of across the world of stop taking the mix, stop making that line of fire with people who have the experience of the adaptation of addiction. Stop doing this. They're not doing it because they are some sort of person that doesn't know how to manage their life or whatever. Something has happened to them that has rocked their world. It's that simple.
I think that, one of the operative words is stigma. And, that's just another way of saying shame. And so, I don't know if you follow Brene Brown's work on vulnerability and shame, but she says that self-compassion is like the elixir to shame. And so I'm happy to see kind of the movement away from the stigma. And I think when I talk about maybe getting pushback, really what I'm talking about is mostly people on the internet where there's no social filter kind of and that's where you can get things that kind of get a little out of control, where they're just not being sensitive. They're not seeing people for people.
No, it's I don't know. I don't know if you had it in America, but in the UK, we used to have the stocks, the village stocks, where you'd done something, and they had the wooden apparatus, and you got your head through and your hands, and you had to sit in the stocks for however many hours, and then people could come and throw stuff at you. I genuinely believe that we haven't moved on. That now social media has become the stocks for everybody. So it's like, well, I'm just going to pelt this, you know, rotten tomato at you. I don't know why, but everybody's doing it. And, you know, we're quite tribal, aren't we, as humans? And that we're caught up in that again. I think I've digressed slightly. Yes, I do.
I don't know, because like self-compassion is like the tool, like when you're all of a sudden part of cancel culture, or what, you know, some of the stuff that you're talking about, you know, when you're in pain from that, and it's a very painful experience, right? Like the answer for yourself is to give yourself grace and love, because what you're going through is a piece of suffering. You know, it can be really hard.
So, Cynthia, I'm looking at the time, literally, as always, we could chat forever, couldn't we? Cynthia, final question. How do you give yourself that? Because, do you know what I mean? I know, because people say to me, oh, I don't see how you can give yourself that type thing. But how do you give yourself grace, kindness, love, and that empathy for yourself that creates the action of compassion? How do you do that? Because to a lot of people, this is alien.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a concept to keep in mind is the idea of common humanity, and that is that everyone suffers. And so it's just as legitimate for me to be kind to my own suffering as it is for me to be kind to anyone else, and vice versa. And then the other half of that answer is practice. And so, you know, like the cards have lines on the back, and the idea is that you fill in this with your compassionate language. And the process that I teach people is an iterative one to keep forming compassionate language. And I'm going to take a little tiny risk here and show you. I'm actually sitting in my kitchen, but if you look, you can see my board, and my broom, but my board has my own language. Like I eat my own dog food. Because it is a practice, just like a mindfulness practice or a running practice. You know, it is something that we need to do for ourselves on a regular basis to really get the full benefit. And, you know, sometimes I call it emotional fitness, because people really understand this idea that you can't just go to the gym once and then you're like, oh, that it, you know, it is actually something that you need to practice to stay fit, right? And so the idea of emotional fitness can help us to frame this, that it is, you know, just like you said, like trauma isn't necessarily a thing that we can eliminate completely out of our lives once we've experienced it, right? It's a thing that we work with, and we kind of take a journey with. And so I think the practice of self-compassion with those types of metaphors just makes a lot of sense for people, because then nobody has the misconception that it's like one and done, like, oh, I figured out my perfect phrase and now now I can go home.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, and it is, isn't it? It's a work in process, and I think that also links to this sense of being authentic. It's not like I'm authentic now and that's it. Really? But things change, people change. So, and it is, isn't it? It's that, like you say, you don't just go to the gym and all of a sudden you've got your abs and everything. It takes time. And also life happens, doesn't it? And sometimes you are going to get up and think, gee, I know in my soul that this doesn't feel good today, so I'm going to go and have my granny's porridge. You know, David, you're going to share yourself, and Cynthia, you're going to write upon your board. Yes. So it is, isn't it? And I think it's also that thing of, it's okay to not be okay. It's normal to not be okay. You've used the word very beautifully about suffering, Cynthia. We're human, we suffer. That's
true. We have no control over that first arrow.
No. As you've said, as the pandemic has shown us, it arrives. Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, you always talk us out. I just want to say, Cynthia, it's just been fantastic. But David, carry on.
Yeah, I want to echo that, Cynthia. Thank you so much It's been so enlightening and so very interesting. And long may you continue to do what you do. I'm just grateful, and I want to say to everyone out there, I'm sure you took something away from this. I certainly did. So thanks, and goodbye. Goodbye, Cynthia. Goodbye, Aneesh.
Bye. Thank you so much. I appreciate the work that you both do in the world, and that you're providing this to people on YouTube. That's fantastic. That's one of the places I hang out in the virtual world.
We shall meet you again. Right. Okay. Bye, everybody, and thank you.
Bye-bye.